Good afternoon. Welcome to the weekly edition of The Wrap. I'm Laura Leslie, WRAL Capitol Bureau Chief.
And I am Will Doran, a WRAL state government reporter.
And the storm this week really put a damper on campaign activities. We had two postponed rallies. First, Kamala postponed hers on Thursday night, and then J.D. Vance was supposed to come Thursday morning, and then he ended up canceling his. So all we had to do all week was campaign finance stuff.
And dodge trees falling on the road.
Yeah, that part. So I mean, and not to make light, I'm very sorry for the people who lost their lives or who were hurt by this storm. But in the political world, it was kind of a quietish week.
Yeah. There was, there was a little bit of news that the state is now investigating a PAC that is backed by Elon Musk. I was looking into this. It's called the America PAC, and it's a pro-Trump group. And it's actually, because of the way it's set up, it's kind of a get out the vote organization. It's actually allowed to coordinate directly with the Trump campaign, which most PACs are not allowed to. But the state is now investigating it. There's a complaint that it has broken multiple North Carolina laws related to basically telling people that it's going to help them register to vote.
And then not doing it.
Doing it, and just taking their phone number, their email address, their date of birth, their name, all of this information, which is really valuable to political campaigns, all of that good, because I don't know, if anyone who's listening is like me, you get all of these texts from political campaigns that are addressed to someone else who is not your name or lives in a different state. I can't tell you how many, texts I get, about Arizona candidates. So having good data is really valuable. And so the allegation is just that this was a fraud, was the word that the complaint used.
And the complainant, we should mention, is he's a Democratic activist, right?
Yes. Yeah. David Wheeler, he ran against Madison Cawthorn a few years back.
That's right. And he was going to run for something else this year, and he ended up not running, I think.
Correct. Yes, he was going to run for Commissioner of Insurance.
That's right.
But decided not to do that and just get back into his muckraking work. His group is called American Muckrakers. So that is how he identifies. But he said, look, I do PAC stuff all the time. I know these laws really well because we try to follow the laws, and I'm watching them break all of these laws. And so I reached out to the America PAC. They weren't able to say anything on the record about this, probably because they are under investigation and, lawyers are heavily involved. But on background, sources familiar say that they stand by everything they did and don't think they did anything illegal. So we'll see how that plays out. But both Josh Stein's office, the Attorney General's office, and also the State Board of Elections are looking into this. Should note, Stein is a Democrat. Board of Elections has a Democratic majority. This is a Republican pro-Trump group. So, infer what you will from all that.
Exactly. So you go from PAC versus PAC, and I've got 501c4 versus 501c4. That was a complaint that was released fully, I would say, Friday. It was a complaint by Carolina Forward. That's a left-leaning group, progressive group. Blair Reeves is their executive director, and they've taken out a complaint that they have sent to the IRS as well as to the Secretary of State's office and State Ethics Commission, basically accusing the Greater Carolina PAC of bankrolling Representative Jason Sain.
And this is the group that was involved with that Kentucky trip.
The Kentucky trip, right? The infamous bourbon tasting trip, right? But they've also been involved in other things like there was a really high-priced tailgate party a couple years ago that our colleague Travis Fain wrote up at the time. They've been involved in multiple sort of things like this. And Jonathan Feltz, who's their spokesperson, said at the time of the bourbon trip, this was a fundraising excursion to get money, and people would buy tickets to get access to lawmakers. That's blunt, but it's also kind of the kind of thing that makes good government people kind of roll their eyes.
Yeah, it's how the system works. But this complaint says they went a little too far.
Yeah, they say basically, and I was talking to David McLennan about this over at Meredith, and 501c4s have a lot of latitude, right? That's a social welfare organization, so it's not a 501c3. They have a little bit more ability to do things in politics. That's why they're so often used for political groups. But there is a line that can't be their primary purpose. But they can lobby, and they can message, and they can accept unlimited amounts of money and then spend that on lawmakers, right, on their behalf. But they can't give it to them. That is the line. So what they're alleging in this complaint is that that's what's happening. I didn't see a lot of evidence of that in the complaint, but I did see a line in there that said, well, if we can subpoena them, then we'll find more records.
Right. Well, and the thing with 501c4s like this, I mean, they're dark money groups. They don't have to disclose their donors. They don't have to disclose how much money is going in or out. It
Right.
really is a black box. And there are certainly defensible reasons for that. But it also leads to, in situations like this, just zero transparency essentially on, groups that are very connected with state politicians. So yeah, it appears that they, yeah, they're like, we don't necessarily have the evidence, but hey, IRS.
We think it's there. Well, it is true that we can at least see what the group's income is on its 990s every year, right? So we know they have made and spent around $1.5 million on quote unquote expenses and traveling, but the group doesn't have any employees. It doesn't have a paid staff of any kind or volunteers. It's got a director who reports spending 0 hours doing this job. And so there is a legit question here. What are those expenses that exactly, right?
Yeah.
What is that made up of? So now Carolina Forward, also a 501c4. I did ask, they did say today they have never paid for anybody's trip expenses or other expenses for elected officials. But, there are so many of these. They're just like mushrooms popping up all over the place. So they must have some serious advantages politically given how many of them we're just seeing. Like there's a new one, Opportunity for NC. An NC Tribune reported on that today. It's linked to Woody White, who's a former state senator, currently, I think, on the board of trustees at UNCW, if I'm remembering correctly. And that one was funding a trip to the Olympics for 5 senators and a housemate and a House member. I'm still trying to get confirmation from those folks and find out if their families went. But, that's a pretty sweet deal. I mean, it's an educational trip, we're told. They were learning about major events and security. Sure.
No better place to do that than on a trip to the Olympics.
Right. That's a great example, right? So I'm sure there's a lot more to report on that, and I'm sure we'll continue to find more interesting stories along those lines.
Yes. Speaking of money, some money we do know about. We got the figures in from the sports betting, the first 3 months basically of sports betting this year, March, April, and May. $50 million in those 3 months. And now...
No, that was June too.
No, it didn't count June. It was just March, April, and May. And this is revenues to the state. So not what people spent, but how much money the state of North Carolina made.
Right. Well, it was $50 million in that first 3.5 months. And then $10.6 million went to the UNC system. So, that was what they said they wanted this for, right?
Yeah. Well, when this was all being debated by Jason Sain, Representative Jason Sain, who is the main force behind this, a big part of it was trying to, make sure they had enough votes to pass it. And so there was a lot of talk about, okay, we got to give money back to especially the smaller colleges, if we're going to be allowing sports betting, the focus is going to be on, the UNCs and the NC States and the ECUs, but, we need to make sure that the HBCUs and the smaller colleges, all get a share of the money coming back to them as well. And of course that, helped make sure that there were some more votes on board for the bill there. But
sure.
And then there is some money also for tourism and, athletic events, like they were learning about at the Olympics just recently.
I'm sorry.
But about a third of the money is going to go just into the general fund to be able to be spent on whatever they want. So, if we extrapolate that out over the course of a year, that's, 150 or more $1 million a year probably.
Yeah, maybe. Maybe more like 78, but that's, it's not bad, I should mention, there is a benefit to the students in those UNC system schools who are getting that money, because that money, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, is supposed to be used for all the athletic stuff that they need. And that's stuff that usually gets charged to students as part of their fees for attending a university. So hopefully that will help to keep a cap. We've heard a lot in recent years about how much those, the schools are keeping their tuition where it is, but the fees are just going through the roof. Hopefully this will help to keep a cap on that.
Yeah.
Let us take a quick break for a minute for the folks who pay our bills, and we will catch you on the other side. Be right back. And welcome back to this week's edition of The Wrap. I'm Laura Leslie here with Will Doran. You did an interesting story over the weekend. We've heard a lot about the Kamalamentum right? You know that they've had the Democrats have seen this surge of excitement and also volunteers and some voter registration. I read a little something about by Chris Cooper out at Western, talking about what he's seen in some patterns of registration of voters after subsequent to her becoming the nominee. But you found an interesting trend in the other direction in rural counties.
Well, I think there's a little bit of both. I think GOP voter registrations are on the rise, and of course that's going to be reflected in rural areas. And then you also see Democrats having a little bit more hope than normal in rural areas. I mean, obviously anyone who's paid attention to North Carolina politics in the last decade has seen Democrats just absolutely bleeding support in rural places. But I talked recently with Cynthia Wallace, who runs this group called the New Rural Project. It's based in Anson County outside of Charlotte, and kind of covers that swath of the state between Charlotte and Lumberton and Fayetteville. And they were saying that, they're knocking on doors and, especially in marginalized communities, looking for, black and brown communities in that part of the state. And they were not getting a whole lot of excitement about Joe Biden, but they do seem to be getting a whole lot of excitement about Kamala Harris. People, especially in those black areas, small black rural towns in North Carolina, seem to be newly excited. And we've seen some polls, a lot more black voters are saying that they are definitely likely to vote. There's all sorts of polls that ask, how likely are you to vote? And when it was Biden on the ticket, they had been said, I'll probably vote. But now a lot of folks are saying, I'm definitely going to vote.
Right. And we also saw that, I think, reflected a little bit in the Carolina Journal poll that came out today, which still had Trump leading Harris in the state because, of course, but Harris had picked up quite a bit of support in comparison to Joe Biden's numbers just a couple of months ago. So it certainly, I'm sure, does give the Democrats at least some hope there. And I'm sure that's one thing when you talk about the rural project and getting out of rural areas. One of the things that the current party chair over there says is that Democrats just didn't ask for rural votes for a long time. They didn't go out and talk to people. So that's kind of been her mission, is to do that. And I'm sure that the surge in volunteers that they're getting probably will not hurt them.
Exactly. And they're obviously really playing catch up to the Trump campaign here. Republicans are very well staffed on the ground all throughout rural North Carolina. Trump has made a point in the past of going to places like Lumberton to hold rallies, and obviously he goes to Charlotte and Greensboro a lot, but he'll also go to the Lumbertons of the world.
Yeah, he was in Lumberton, I think, twice, wasn't it? Or at least that area.
Mm-hmm. And he came to Selma, although I don't know if Johnson County counts as rural anymore.
I don't know. Well, it's on the cusp, right? Yeah. It's just shoulder county. It is telling to me that the Trump campaign is beginning to spend money, and quite a bit of money in the state, where we had not seen that before a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, they clearly did not see North Carolina as particularly worrisome when Biden was on the ticket. And I think a lot of us saw the polling numbers and would agree.
Yeah.
All the polls were Trump +6, Trump +8. I think I saw the one that was like Trump +10, which seems almost unthinkable in, what we consider to be almost a swing state. But then since it's been Kamala Harris, the polls have been more like Trump +1, Trump +3. So she has really clearly cut into the lead here. The Trump campaign just this week started spending money on TV ads for the first time in North Carolina. So, saying, oh, all right, we need to compete here all of a sudden.
Well, I'm curious to see when they decide to come back, because Vance was following Kamala this week. And then Kamala was trying to do a round of all the swing states in the days after she's, sort of cemented her nomination. And so we'll see who gets back here first and what they do about it, right? In the meantime, one sort of non-election story I wanted to mention is a couple things, actually. One of them is that the state health plan is apparently, we've heard for a while that it's running out of money, but Treasurer Falwell said this week, no, really. It's really, really running out of money. Like, they're not going to be able to pay their bills by 2026 is the point that he was trying to make. I think it was on an AMA call on Tuesday morning.
Yeah. He said that for a variety of reasons. One, healthcare is getting more expensive and people are living longer. So that's obviously causing fiscal issues for the health plan. But also, he has for years been asking for the state legislature to fund the state health plan more similarly to how they fund the pension plan, and just put in just injections of cash.
Right, to keep up with growth.
Right, and the legislature has been very much opposed to that. I mean, I think I wrote stories as long ago as 2017 when Falwell first took office as treasurer that he was asking for this, and it just hasn't happened.
Right.
And so he said with all of, just the combined fiscal stresses on the system, and then he said after COVID, the health plan took on hundreds of millions of dollars in costs getting tests done and things like that they were supposed to get reimbursed for. And he said the federal government sent the money to the state legislature, which then has not sent it all on to the state health plan. So
kept more of it. Yeah. Imagine that. Sticky fingers, right?
Sticky fingers.
Yeah.
So he, like I said, this is something he's been talking about for years. Obviously, the state health plan continues to operate. They haven't raised premiums, I don't believe. Maybe some slight raises, but nothing major.
And that's one thing that I've heard from lawmakers, because lawmakers on the record don't want to come out and say he should raise premiums, right? Because that would be politically unpopular. But behind the scenes, you hear them say, well, nobody else in the U.S. has had the same premiums for 7 or 8 years, right? Get real. This is what the market is doing. Realistically, practically speaking, it's time to raise some premiums.
Yeah.
But the state health plan is kind of in a bind on that because they're already high enough that they're having trouble attracting the young people who kind of stabilize the plan, who put into the plan but don't use a lot, right?
Right.
So the more expensive you make it, the more you price those younger people out, and you end up with the older and sicker people in your plan.
And then it just spirals out of control.
And then it spirals out of control. We should mention, though, in defense of the state health plan, that it turns out that Aetna's CEO apparently got the boot. CVS parted ways with that person. It did not look like it was that person's idea, but a lot of it had to do with a huge drop in earnings that had to do with just spiraling costs of healthcare. So it's not just the state health plan.
Yep. Well, Aetna will be taking over control of the state health plan in January.
Yep.
After Blue Cross decided not to appeal the decision taking the contract away from it. So
we'll see how that goes.
Changes in leadership, changes in plans, lots of changes, and we're going to have a new state treasurer in January too.
That's right.
So because Falwell is not running for re-election since he'd run for governor and didn't win that primary. So lots of change coming to the world of state employees and how they get their health care.
Yeah, I think that's just one more thing to mention for this week, because we were busy talking about it because of power outages this week, right? With a storm, the state is receiving $57 million from the feds as part of, I think, the bipartisan, it breaks down from different funds, but basically they're putting in a bunch of money to help the state start rebuilding some of its incredibly old transmission infrastructure. And they're starting with a line between, for example, Wake County and Harnett County. And if you look at it on paper, it's only going to help 14,000 people, right? But it's traveling through an area that's really growing quickly, right? So it's going to be able to serve those areas as those areas build up and have demand. So, they're talking about, Jennifer Granholm was here, Secretary of Energy, talking about this and talking about the importance of trying to do, when you think about infrastructure, people think, roads, bridges, highways.
The dams that we saw breaking during Tropical Storm Debbie
good
here.
Lord, yes, exactly. But they don't think about the electrical system. But she said, the grid, the U.S. grid is the largest machine in the world, and it hasn't been updated for the most part since the 1960s.
There's a cheery thought for you.
Yep. Scheduled maintenance due. Anyway, so anyway, that story that is a project to come in years to come.
Yeah. Well, we are expecting all of the campaigns to really start heating up now that we are into August. I imagine we'll have much more news for y'all on the next edition of the Wrap. Maybe we'll know some more about when Kamala Harris is coming back and when J.D. Vance or Donald Trump are coming back, since their visits got canceled this week. But I imagine it's going to be soon.
They may all three of them have been here by the time we do another Wrap. That's how this season's going. Anyway,
that is true.
Thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.